What is going on, guys, and welcome back to Touchdowns to Home Runs. My name is Bernie. Thank you for joining us today on the Touchdowns to Home Runs show. Hope that your day is going absolutely fantastic. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I made a video breaking down some of the potential draft targets that the Raptors could have at the number 4 position. But today, we're going to be specifically focusing in on how these draft targets would actually transfer and fit into the Raptors roster. So today, we'll be breaking down the good parts of each of these potential draft picks, but also the potential downsides with the draft picks as well. And just before we get into the video, just keep in mind that the only assumption I'm making in this video is that Cade Cunningham is a lock at the number 1 pick, but I am assuming that everybody else available in this draft has the potential in some way to fall down to the Raptors at number 4. But the first guy that we have is Evan Mobley, and let's start with the good part of this potential draft pick. And obviously, if Evan Mobley slid down to the Raptors at 4, in my opinion, it would be the best case scenario in the entire draft for them. But again, I highly doubt that this would happen. Evan Mobley is a 20-year-old 7-foot center who averaged 16.4 points per game, 8.7 rebounds, 2.4 assists, and 2.9 blocks last year for USC. Now, when we look at sort of how this would benefit for the Raptors, it's pretty obvious. He's basically, in the draft, the best way to immediately address the Raptors center issue and lack of depth that they have at the number 5 position. Plus, on top of that, you're getting a generational player, in my opinion, and a phenomenal two-way player that I think the Raptors could really use. Everybody talks about how good Evan Mobley is as an inside player, but he's also very capable on defense, which is something that I really like. He's got a natural jumping ability, makes him a natural rim protector. I think Raptors fans would really like him. Now, the potential downside of this pick would have to be the timeline, in my opinion, and how he would fit into the Raptors timeline. You know, you look at what the Raptors weren't able to do last year, but you look at still a really quality core. Siakam, Anunoby, Van Vliet, Gary Trent Jr. And I genuinely believe that the Raptors are still 1 or 2 pieces or the development of Siakam or Anunoby into a real star in order to be able to leapfrog back into the upper end of the Eastern Conference. You look at sort of how long it takes centers to develop at the NBA level. It's definitely the hardest position, in my opinion. And only dating back a year where James Wiseman was the number 2 pick, you know, he had a pretty disappointing year. So even though I think Evan Mobley is definitely more transferable to the NBA and obviously a much different game because I think he's a lot more athletic than James Wiseman is, you know, you have to believe that there could potentially be some difficulties where the Raptors need a winning center right now, or that's at least what Raptors fans are hoping for, and Evan Mobley probably wouldn't be able to really start reaching his potential until maybe 3 years down the line. But with that being said, if Evan Mobley falls down to the number 4 pick, this would obviously be the pick. He's a generational player. I talked about how he plays 2 ways basketball, more transferable than a guy like James Wiseman, so definitely would be the pick if he does fall. Next up, we got Jalen Green, starting on the good side. With Fred VanVleet, Malachi Flynn, the potential return of even Lowry, the Raptors would still be undersized in their front court. And, you know, on top of that, you would be adding some size, also a prolific scorer with Jalen Green. I think something that the Raptors could use even if he starts off the bench for the Raptors next year. In 2020-2021, 17.9 points per game, 4.1 rebounds, 2.8 assists, 1.5 steals. But again, as I was saying, adds that 6'5" frame to a very undersized backcourt, and yeah, just overall adds some size to the lineup. He's also pretty much the best scorer in the draft, not necessarily the best shooter, but the best all-around scorer. He's a tremendous athlete who can pressure opposition and defenses when he attacks downhill. He can shoot, drive, really do it all. Got some fantastic range as well. The Raptors do already have the potential to have a really solid defensive team, in my opinion, so adding a just real great scorer like this could be something that the Raptors could definitely use. Potential downside with Jalen Green has to be the question around what else he can do, you know, to expand his game beyond just being solely a scorer. I think that some of his issues are definitely things that you can address at the NBA level. You know, defensive utility, just put some more effort on the defensive side of the ball, work on the ball handling, things like that. But you know, the Raptors have to ask themselves, do you want to go down a path of sort of a Norman Powell 2.0? Because these two guys really do have a lot of the same issues. And, you know, even right now, the Raptors have Gary Trent Jr. If they do end up re-signing him back, for whatever the price of that contract is going to be, you would have two really only scorers on your team. So it depends on just how the Raptors sort of want to balance that. But again, I think that these questions are just solely hypothetical, because if Jalen Green does fall down to the number 4 pick, I mean, Jalen Green is obviously the pick here. Now where it starts to get a little bit interesting, because we're getting more into the range of the players and draft prospects that I think will actually be there come when the Raptors are on the clock. Now, the guy now that we have is Jalen Suggs. We'll start with the good side. Jalen Suggs would obviously make a lot of sense for the Raptors, especially if they don't bring Lowry back next season, because he's a guy who could, at least somewhat sort of fix and work to fix that hole that Lowry would leave. He's a 6'4" point guard, had a phenomenal season last year for Gonzaga, 14.4 points per game, 5.3 rebounds, 4.5 assists, and 1.9 steals. Now, Jalen Suggs is really the kind of player that ends up being a fan favorite in Toronto. He does a lot of things right. He's got a phenomenal work ethic, but he's also the guy that you want from a specifically, basketball standpoint at the point guard position. He's a two-way player who moves really well off ball, has great leadership skills, tremendous athleticism, and is very decisive with his passes. So in terms of efficiency, really good. He's a guy that you can trust to attack the rim. He's really fast, especially in the half court. He's a guy who can help you on fast breaks as well. And I think whether he comes off the bench, he's a guy who could be a leader there, or even a guy who could potentially be slotted right into the starting lineup and work at the 1 with Fred VanVleet at the 2, I think could be a really interesting look. Potential downside of Suggs here is he needs to work on his shooting. I think, if you lose Lowry, you're losing a big chunk of sort of the scoring that does come from your guard play. And even though Fred VanVleet had a pretty good scoring season last year, he's a bit inconsistent and really never had to be that number 1 option from the guard position. Jalen Suggs wasn't necessarily an inefficient shooter for Gonzaga, but it's something that he could definitely use to develop in order to be a real NBA star point guard. The issue that I think for the Raptors is, again, around that scoring and the lack of scoring that they would have from their backcourt if Lowry does leave. So you would want Jalen Suggs to sort of step up and step into that role. And then, you have a surplus of guards. So how do you want to sort of balance that? And I think that makes it real interesting, with Jonathan Kuminga, and talks about him potentially coming up to that number 4 pick. If, you think you have too many guards and you go with Kuminga, who's a little more raw, doesn't immediately impact you the same way that Suggs would, but potentially a higher ceiling. So the final guy that we do have, Jonathan Kuminga, we'll start with the good side of him. He's a player, as I was sort of mentioning before, that if you don't want to go down the guard route again, you think you have too many guys there, you go with Kuminga. Even though he's not an immediate impact player, you get a guy with potentially the most upside that you could get at that position if Cunningham, Mobley, and Green are already off the table. In 2020, 2021, played for the G League Ignite, 15.8 points per game, 7.2 rebounds, 2.7 assists. And again, he's a really talented player. He's unstoppable at the rim, good finisher, especially with 2 hands through contact. Plays 2 ways as well, with a really solid ability to be able to block shots. He's a bit inconsistent, but he can shoot a bit. He's got a little bit of range as well, and he can be a playmaker out of the drives, passing out of drives, which I think is something that is very, very useful. In terms of the downside with Kuminga, his offensive game especially is very raw, not a tremendous shooter, has tendency to over dribble and so on. And I go back to sort of what I was discussing with Evan Mobley earlier on in this video in terms of the timeline of Kuminga for the Raptors, because I think, again, you're 1 or 2 pieces away from being able to leapfrog back into contention for the Eastern Conference, or even just the development of Anunoby or Siakam if you look internally on the Raptors roster, right? And specifically Kuminga, because he doesn't address the same positional needs that the Raptors have at the 5 position. He's a small forward, power forward, which obviously the Raptors already have taken care of. So I think going with a guy like Kuminga over Suggs is definitely a lot more risky. There's definitely benefits to it. But, unless Mobley or Green are still on the table, and if you're really deciding between Suggs and Kuminga, I would still lead towards Suggs just because, especially with or without Lowry coming back, I think provides some benefits there. And Kuminga, just in terms of the timeline, I think, potentially causes a lot more issues. But anyways, guys, if you did make it to this point in the video, thank you. Let me know your thoughts, comments, predictions on anything that I talked about today. If you did enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a thumbs up, subscribe to Touchdowns to Home Runs for more content just like this. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.